Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the NARM Training Institute. I'm your host, Emily Ruth, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. Hi, Transforming Trauma listeners. If you're a licensed mental health professional working with complex trauma and are interested in learning the neuroaffective relational model, we're excited to share with you about our upcoming NARM therapist trainings. The Level 2 NARM therapist training is a clinical training designed for licensed mental health professionals, current mental health graduate students, and active clinical interns and trainees, where you will get trained in a comprehensive developmental framework and clinical approach for resolving the long-term impacts of ACEs and CPTSD. As you are learning and integrating NARM, you will receive individualized support from a team of skilled, passionate, and supportive trainers led by NARM senior faculty Brad Kammer. If you're interested in learning to support the healing of complex trauma, we encourage you to register now to reserve your spot. For more information and to register, please visit www.narmtraining.com/schedule. And now for our interview. Michael Niconchuk is an applied neuroscience researcher and practitioner focusing on psychological trauma recovery in conflict-affected populations, migration, and violence prevention. Michael has written several innovative scientific articles on issues of neuroscience, violent extremism, and intergroup conflict. He is the author of the Field Guide for Barefoot Psychology, a psychoeducational and trauma recovery program for communities affected by trauma and forced displacement. Michael is a former Fulbright scholar and holds degrees from Tufts University and University College London. Please enjoy this conversation between Michael Niconchuk and Brad Kammer.
All right, Michael, welcome to Transforming Trauma.
Thank you.
Yeah, so happy to have you here. I was telling you before we met here on the recording that I saw you. I didn't know anything about you or your work. And Larry, the founder of NARM, this model, was presenting either before you or after you. I think before you.
Right before.
And so I was sitting there in my bedroom watching you guys on Zoom because it was pretty early morning, California time. Yeah. And you came on and I was just so inspired and impressed and wanting to learn more about you and your work. So I'm just so grateful to have this opportunity to learn more about you and your work.
I was grateful to be asked to be there, to share that stage with so many personal heroes, professional heroes, and icons. And I am really honored to be here.
Great. Well, maybe we can just start with who you are, what your work is about, and then we can go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I guess the way that I usually start this story is about the why. Why did I get into this line of work at all? Mm-hmm. You know, I had some early mentors confirm for me when I was much younger that the best research is me-search. A lot of us get into the things that we get into professionally because they have some personal relevance. Of course, there's a ton of biases that can go into that as a result, and especially when working in anything to do with the human mind and the way we think and the way we feel. But I got into this line of work because of my own family history. My mom is from Guatemala, and, you know, as some of your viewers might know, there was a pretty long civil conflict in that country from 1960 to 1996 when the peace accords were signed between various rebel entities and the Guatemalan government brokered by the United Nations. While my mom's family wasn't particularly politically involved, my mom directly and many members of her family had been exposed to elements of that violence and conflict in the country, including her father being taken and kidnapped and beat up and bloodied and sent back to their house. And when I was in university, all these years later, I was born and raised in the U.S. My brother and I never experienced any of that conflict. My mom left the country in the late 80s. And, you know, years later, I ended up working back in Guatemala, and I was working with some folks that identified as combatants of the civil conflict. And through a series of odd and serendipitous conversations, it turned out that they were from the same unit of the guerrilla movement that had kidnapped my grandfather. And when this information sort of came to light, it was obviously a massively triggering revelation for my mother, for my grandmother. Oddly enough, my grandfather, who survived all of that, was sort of quiet about it. But knowing that, you know, from my mom, knowing that her son was working directly on behalf of or for the betterment of the children of those combatants that had ruined so much of her childhood, who had, you know, severed the trust she had that her father would come back alive, that she would stay alive. You know, in his kidnapping, there was a ransom involved, that they would rape and kill his oldest daughter if he didn't come up with the money, et cetera, et cetera. So basically, I was just sitting in an extended way and gaining accolades and credit for the work that I was doing by sitting on this massive trigger for my family's trauma during the conflict. Fast forward 2 years later, that experience confirmed for me that I knew that I wanted to work in the long-term implications, the political, the social, the personal implications of conflict-related trauma. And over the years, that took many forms. My undergraduate work was actually in political science and classical Arabic, so very far from the world of clinical psychology. And my graduate work was actually in social cognition, so more on social psychology, but focusing on the interaction of social cognition and our stress response system. And so I ended up working with communities of refugees in Jordan many years later. It reminded me so much of what I had seen in my own family, but years and years and years earlier in the process. The reaction I was seeing in my mother and grandmother of this deeply triggered, activated response 30 years after the signature of the peace accords, or 20 years after, I was seeing young men, young women coming directly out of the conflict in Syria. And I felt like I was watching two ends of this process. One, immediately what happens in the aftermath, and then seeing the untreated aftermath 20, 30 years later. So there's just such a rich set of opportunities, but also of shrinking opportunities for folks to process, integrate, and move forward in a way that takes into account the depth of what conflict-related and war-related trauma is and what it does to people, what it does to communities, what it does to cultures. And so those different experiences of my own family and then working in humanitarian response for the Syria crisis in Jordan, increase the conviction that we have to address the issue of trauma in some way, shape, or form. And it's not going to exclusively be through getting therapists for every refugee out there.
Yeah. Okay, so much to unpack, and I'm so curious about your story. But before we kind of dive deeper into it, I'm just curious, what would you hope in terms of listeners to this podcast? This is a question we ask a lot at the outset. What would you hope listeners would take away from your work and your story here?
The first one is a pretty hefty dose of humility, because I've been slapped in the face with the cold hand of humility quite a few times. First of all, not being a clinician and trying to advocate for and increase the accessibility to trauma-focused services. I've learned a lot about the privileges that I'm afforded and allowed to be able to talk about this stuff. Race, gender, passport, how all those things play a role in the opportunities and facility I have to be put on stages like the one that you and I met on. Mm-hmm. And then realizing that the depth of the gap, not a gap, I guess the depth of difference between, for example, the way that a young Muslim refugee understands the self, the soul, the heart, suffering, compared to the average secular American therapist. And the space between those two ways of knowing self, ways of knowing trauma, ways of knowing healing, is really significant. And I don't think we give enough credit to understanding the cultural gap between a lot of the folks that we see on the receiving end of these services and those providing.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I mean, that's not even just like across countries. That even happens in the United States in terms of just the gap between the service providers or at least the people that are making the decisions about what kind of service provision will happen, and then the people that are they really being supported by the kind of work that they're receiving? So you have this family background, and then at some point, I mean, you were in college, it sounds like, and then at some point you got interested in this humanitarian work. Tell us about your own kind of trajectory from growing up in this family system that had this unresolved trauma to then moving into this work.
Yeah, as soon as I finished that, working in Guatemala, it was during later college years and right after college. Then I ended up getting connected with a British psychotherapist who had years ago partnered with a Kashmiri psychologist to open a trauma clinic in Srinagar in the Kashmir Valley. And they were mostly catering to men and their families who had been mujahideen in the conflict in Afghanistan or in various insurgencies in the Kashmir Valley. And it was another crash course in just the sheer size of the challenge, in systems where largely colonial models of medicalized healthcare end up with either under or over medicating populations, increasing stigma, not necessarily tapping into existing culturally sanctioned models of care and support. I was seeing that in a very different context from Guatemala. And then I ended up getting this volunteership in Jordan. I had studied classical Arabic, and I really wanted to study or work with a local partner who could help me better understand and think about the role of sort of trauma-informed care in education systems, looking 2-3 generations. So I had gotten an opportunity from a local Jordanian organization to help them design some research on integrating trauma-informed care into the school curriculum for dropouts, mostly young Palestinian origin students in the country, in the Kingdom of Jordan. And that was in April 2012. And so I went to Jordan, and that was right when Syria, the conflict started to escalate. So when I arrived in Jordan, there was maybe 20,000 Syrians in the country. By July, there was almost 3,000 people crossing the border every single night. So in July of 2012 was when the government of Jordan decided to open a refugee camp, Zatari refugee camp, right on the border of Syria. And it's quite unconventional in terms of traditional refugee camp policies, because as per international conventions, most refugee camps are supposed to be around 50 kilometers inland from the initial border crossing. Obviously, for safety and protection reasons, this camp, because of the difficulties in securing that large of a piece of land in Jordan, was only around 9 kilometers from the Syrian border, which means that it was incredibly close. And you could, even for many years, the first couple of years of the camp, actively hear and feel the bombs being dropped on the other side. So it wasn't necessarily a trigger-free environment for its residents. And that camp quickly ballooned in size to around 140,000 people, becoming the second largest refugee camp in the world. And my job with a local organization called QuestScope was initially to help in the humanitarian coordination, but also think particularly about how we set up restorative and alternative justice pathways for young asylum seekers who had come into contact with the law. So a lot of my work in that time was in setting up sort of psychosocial support programs, peer mentoring programs, alternative education programs for these violence-involved or law-involved young people, and working and establishing community policing systems. And so that quickly pushed me back into this world of how incredibly stressed communities make decisions. And I had the, I guess, unfortunate opportunity of witnessing that decision-making process for a lot of really desperate and devastated young men who ended up making decisions to go back to Syria and fight with different armed elements in the country, be it the Free Syria Army or more sinister groups that later became known as, Jabhat al-Nusra or the Islamic State. And, I would cease contact with them, but down the line, I heard stories of, oh, this person died, this person's brother was killed, this person blew themselves up, this person was killed in an airstrike, whatever it might be. And it was witnessing that pre-departure, the decision-making, the agonizing yet deeply logical decision-making that's rooted in pain and trauma and suffering, in desperation, and how these systemic realities of being a displaced person, especially being a displaced, destitute young man, completely dependent on a state and a system that you don't know and understand. How do we then expect to focus on psychosocial support and trauma recovery when the systemic oppression and systemic disempowerment is so real? And so I knew then that I wanted to spend more energy on really thinking about what does trauma recovery and psychosocial support mean for folks that are living in still incredibly stressful, dangerous environments. Because let's think of hypervigilance, for example. That's a deeply adaptive skill for a young refugee living in a dangerous camp.
Sure.
So is there an incentive to get rid of that symptom? To reduce that symptom as part of a standard protocol for treating the effects of trauma or chronic stress? It's just important questions that came up for me as time went on, which led us to eventually develop the field guide for Barefoot Psychology, which we highlighted at the trauma conference last year.
One of the things I'm really struck by, and it really touches me, is the way that you're talking about working with people that are actually kind of, for lack of a better term, the perpetrators of violent extremism, and really understand. I mean, there's this saying in the trauma world for a long time, which is now used very pop psychology, but it's like hurt people hurt people. And there's so much wisdom to that and compassion in that. And I don't think we talk enough about that in the trauma field, at least in the United States. So much of it is around the quote victims, but not a lot about how people that have been traumatized have such a high percentage of then being the people that continue to perpetuate the trauma. And it sounds like you were seeing that firsthand, and not just seeing it, but kind of being present with them as they were struggling with how they're going to work with this trauma? Are they going to act it in? Are they going to act it out? Are they going to heal it? And I just wonder if you could kind of take us through that a little bit more.
It's incredibly painful to watch what happens to folks when they live not only through, for example, war-related trauma, but then they're shoved into systems of care that are there to protect them, but frankly, that at best simply keep them alive.
Yeah.
And that's not a criticism of any humanitarian actor specifically, but a reality of scarcity, a reality of the scarcity of resources available for humanitarian assistance, reality of the scarcity mindset that has been inculcated in folks being raised in oppressive and/or authoritarian environments or in deeply patriarchal societies. I mean, there's 1,000 layers to this, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's really important for me not to frame those living in refugee camps as perpetrators by any means, because that's dangerous and I think potentially could be seen as Islamophobic, which is not at all what I'm trying to say. Yes, I've spent my career working with predominantly Muslim refugees. And as in any society, there are victims, there are perpetrators, there are bystanders, there are people that are all three of those things at the exact same time.
Yeah.
And of course, taking an asset-based approach, there's tremendous resilience, but I also take issue with the language of resilience because by focusing on the assets, or by focusing on the skills and assets and resilience that folks have, sometimes that same language has been used to not change the system that is actively oppressing people. I can highlight the resilience of refugees until tomorrow, and it's very true, but that doesn't change the system that's actively oppressing them. So I'd rather focus on the systems that we've established that continue to prevent folks from healing. And, as you were saying, study after study for the past 20, 30 years has shown correlations between particularly early childhood trauma or developmental trauma and negative outcomes, whether it's addiction, intimate partner violence, criminal behavior, recidivism into crime post-release, aggression, violent forms of activism. We can make a huge list of things that trauma is correlated with as far as antisocial outcomes. And that's not to say that there's any monocausality there, that trauma is inherently and uniquely causal of any of those social phenomena. But the same thing is true for folks living in refugee camps. Of course, there's going to be an increase in family problems and stress and intimate partner violence in a place where people are traumatized and constantly and deliberately put under stress.
Yeah.
So in any given moment, folks are playing multiple and complex roles. And if you take a look at the assistance given for mental health in humanitarian aid, if you look at the overall amounts of health aid, support for mental health care is, I think, less than 0.5% of overall global health support.
Mm-hmm.
And if we know that stress and trauma have physical health consequences as well as social behavioral consequences, I still can't really understand the narrative that justifies continued underspending, and particularly underspending for adult men. The largest human source of trauma in the world is adult men, and yet they are some of the most underserved in humanitarian and development programming when it comes to mental health and psychosocial support. And that's partially because we don't actually know what to do with those populations. Yeah. It's really hard to attract adult men into mental health programming.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a hypothesis about why there's such resistance to investing more, or at least respecting more the impact of mental health in these different systems?
One is cost. When I meet with my therapist, it costs me a significant amount of money every single session. Mm-hmm. Because I tried to find someone that was like-minded, that was recommended, that's good quality, well-trained, and it's expensive as a result.
Yeah.
So high-quality care has historically almost always been very expensive. And so I think there's just a scalability and a financing aspect that good mental health care has historically been expensive, and we can barely do it right for rich people. So obviously we're not going to export high-quality care to poor people. I mean, it's just a sad logic of a capitalist system that is in control of humanitarian aid. Second of all, I think there's a unique challenge in finding therapists and mental health professionals and paraprofessionals, highly trained lay folks in the community who can do certain types of interventions that have the same cultural paradigm as the client populations. And I'll say this until I'm blue in the face, that just because someone is brown and has a beard and is Muslim doesn't mean that they're going to be a good cultural fit for a Syrian refugee in Jordan.
Yeah.
Right? Because if you take a well-trained therapist from the capital cities of most Arab countries, they've largely been trained in English in their higher education and on very Western models of care with some of the more antiquated protocols that have now been sort of developed upon and iterated upon and innovated upon in the West. And then they're performing many of those services in places where they're severely underpaid and undersupported. So folks aren't necessarily getting folks that look, talk, and sound like them. And in some of the work that we were doing when I was with Beyond Conflict, one of the challenges that we faced was around terminology. I can't tell you the number of highly trained mental health professionals in the Middle East who almost exclusively use English terminology for some more of their advanced psychoeducation. And it's a huge challenge because that in and of itself is isolating for folks that can barely read or that don't want to spend their tiny cognitive bandwidth learning words like sympathetic nervous system. We had to do a lot of digging to go back to some origin concepts. And I guess another hypothesis here is that, of course, conflict and war predominantly negatively affects women and children, and therefore those are populations that should be prioritized, as well as other particularly vulnerable groups. But at the same time, I also think it's just easier. Even in the US, reaching men of color has been a challenge because of issues of representation on the providers, but also on cultural barriers and stigma. There's tremendous stigma towards sharing your secrets with a stranger. That's a completely unfamiliar concept in the Middle East, which is often tribal, which is often information is currency, information is weaponized in non-democratic environments. So it's just a strange concept to go and share my secrets with a stranger.
So I wanted to come back to, well, you used a word and then a word came up for me in our work. You used a word about colonial kind of mindset that comes into a lot of these systems that are supporting the humanitarian efforts in other countries. And one of the things that we talk about in our work is about the way that developmental and complex trauma objectifies human beings. And so I wondered if that's a term that you use or how that might kind of coincide. You talked about patriarchal and colonial and the way that when you're in these systems that you're no longer seen as your full humanity, but getting boxed in different ways and how that can perpetuate ongoing trauma.
I can give a really recent and acute example. I was just in Kazakhstan a couple of weeks ago, and we've been working with the University of Illinois Chicago and Boston Children's Hospital with Dr. Stephen Wine and Dr. Heidi Ellis and some other colleagues on supporting Kazakh civil society for the rehabilitation of men, women, and children who left Kazakhstan to go with the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq and who are now being returned to Kazakhstan. And we've been doing some work with, for example, in-prison theologians, with social workers, with probation officers. And I did a case study exercise with them, and it divided the room. It was quite polarizing. In this case study, I gave a case example of a young man named Ali Khan, of course that's not his real name, who had, for various reasons, social isolation. He had an abusive father. There was, some specific life-altering events that he went through. There was an aperture for radicalization through some contacts that he had. He ended up joining the Islamic State in Syria. He eventually was returned to Kazakhstan, served a prison sentence, et cetera, and then was released, put in a probation system, never returned to a life of terrorism, and then several years later was arrested on a domestic violence charge. And I asked the room, is this a success story? The room is pretty evenly split. Most of the female psychologists said, no, this isn't a success story. Most of the male psychologists, theologians, and probation officers said, yes, this is a success story because he did not return to a life of crime. And I think that attitude is emblematic of a lot of the ways in which systems treat those who have been traumatized or affected by war or conflict, that we often reduce them to the sum of the experiences that are of a security concern, right? We deal with refugees as being traumatized by war and conflict, not necessarily being traumatized by years of electricity cuts, of scarcity, of increasing domestic violence, of food shortages. of horrible weather, of absolutely unbearable living conditions in camps that we have supported and placed them in. And it's not to say that we're deliberately, yes, we're providing people safety and shelter, but the refusal to admit that the post-big trauma environments can themselves be traumatizing and stressful complicates the narrative. So when we have sessions that are focused almost exclusively on the war-related or the displacement-oriented trauma, we're actually ignoring some of the pre-conflict experiences that might have contributed to the way to which folks responded to the things that they lived during war. In the case of Ali Khan, his abusive father, stuff in his childhood, he ended up repeating that trauma later in life. But the system was dealing with him in a way in which what was of most concern was that he didn't go back to a life of terrorism. And that's a perfectly fine goal to have. But especially for brown and black men, I think, the system is so focused on preventing negative outcomes that the process of dealing with them in systems of care can in and of itself be dehumanizing.
Yeah. We talk a lot in our work about differentiating between states, internal states, and behaviors. And so much of psychology, at least in the modern era, is focused on behavioral change, symptom reduction, behavioral change like you're describing. And in our work, we believe that often that can reinforce objectification. Like as a child, if your parents are just trying to, extinguish your behavior, they're not taking time to check in where that behavior is actually emerging from. And that's a failure of attunement from the parents. And we're then perpetuating that as mental health professionals by focusing on, okay, let's just keep them out of jail or keep them from doing these behaviors, but not understanding really what's driving them. And from our perspective, many of those behaviors are actually just adaptive strategies to manage the disorganization and dysregulation that they don't have any other way of managing. Does that align with your perspective?
A lot of the ways that we ended up, teaching folks in psychoeducation sessions focused on the first lesson was always, your brain has one job. It's trying to keep you alive. And we spend quite a bit of time, and it's quite a laborious lesson to get through because we try to use multiple metaphors to get that point across because it is so critical to have folks understand and have an ounce of self-compassion and forgiveness that even some of the most perverse behaviors that we see downstream as sort of trauma-related sequelae are fundamentally attempts to keep the person, the host, alive. This is what your brain does in its organism of the body. It's trying to keep its host alive at all costs. And in doing so, it can alter everything from your immune system to your cardiovascular health, to your respiratory function, to your sleep patterns, to the size of your amygdala, to the way that you view others, to the way that you behave with others, to your levels of trust, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it fundamentally boils down to that one core objective of your brain trying to keep you alive. And there's another principle that I've learned from Dr. Ken Reedy, who works a lot on counter-extremism, and he sort of elucidated for me this principle of multifinality and equifinality. There are many roads that lead to Rome. There are many reasons why someone might be an extremist. One of the reasons could include childhood trauma, for example. At the same time, childhood trauma and a principle of multifinality can lead to many possible negative outcomes, as we've seen in those studies that have correlated trauma exposure with multiple unwanted and or antisocial behaviors in adulthood. So it's to say that there's that core element, and we have to think, what are those adaptations that happen within the self, within the physical body, within the way that we understand the world around us, those changes in brain, body, behavior, and self-concept that can lead to multiple possible negative outcomes. And treating exclusively those unwanted behaviors, I think that's been highlighted for violence-involved folks. And they know when they're being treated that way, when the entire system is just trying to prevent one outcome without actually caring about me as a person, hearing me, seeing me.
Yeah. I mean, I feel the pain of it even as we're talking about it now and just how painful that is for people. So you mentioned before that you were part of creating the field guide for Barefoot Psychology, which when I heard you talk about that, I was like, oh, that is so cool. I want to know more about it. So can you share more about first where that came from, how that emerged, and then what that resource actually is?
Yeah, the inklings of it first occurred in 2016. I was having a conversation with some friends who were living in Zatri refugee camp in Jordan. And these are mostly adult men, some women who obviously had lived through a tremendous amount of stress and trauma because of the war itself and because of the subsequent life in a refugee camp. And we were talking about various experiences that they had had, why they hadn't sought therapy, what was so scary and taboo about it. And there was one case in particular of a young man who had attempted self-harm, who really needed psychological support. And time again, we tried to encourage him to seek support, but there were various barriers within himself that prevented him from doing so. And we started talking, just about some of the emergent findings that I was reading about and learning about from neurobiology and neuroscience around some of the sort of neurobiological things that go on within the person with the experience of stress, chronic stress, and trauma. And that information, even though it was limited and provided by a non-clinician like myself, was somehow relieving for this person. And so that series of conversations ended up taking shape through some early support from the Ford Foundation into Beyond Conflict, being able to convene myself and some scientists, some clinicians, some other folks' lived experience, to creating a multi-chapter book that taught different elements of the neurobiology of stress and trauma in a way that was highly accessible. To make it more readable, if you're sitting in a refugee camp, the last thing you want to do or have time to do is to read a book. Right? So the way that we thought we could make it more engaging was to couch that information in story and narrative. And so we fictionalized the lived experiences of many of the folks in the refugee camp and turned that into a multi-chapter set of vignettes. And each vignette was then used to teach sort of an anonymized, safe way of the science of stress and trauma. So by investing a lot of reactions, unwanted behaviors and symptoms in these fictionalized characters, it provided a face-saving way for folks who don't want to disclose their personal information or personal traumas to ask questions about the characters, to engage with the characters who we had invested with all of the taboo symptoms, thoughts of self-harm, sexual dysfunction, all of these different things that couldn't necessarily be talked about in a group setting or in a community. And we had, Beyond Conflict was able to, we had resources from different partners to bring folks together. And then I had the privilege of meeting Dr. Vivian Kadari, who proved so central to the formation of the book and then subsequently the randomized control trial that Beyond Conflict was able to do on the field guide, showing some of its positive impacts on folks' symptoms and on stigma in Zaatari refugee camp. And, I'd encourage folks to check out her work and the randomized control trial that she did on the intervention. And, the concept it was an idea that came together during a pandemic, but then we were able to, test it, turn it into a series of videos, some of which are now we have them in English and Arabic and Russian for some of our Kazakh and Russian speaking partners, really highly accessible ways that use storytelling and hardcore science to give folks a little bit of self-compassion and deeper insight into the way that the brain and body is responding to stress and trauma. Because you'd be surprised as to how little good quality psychoeducation materials are available in other languages.
Yeah.
And even in English, we have to wade through, 1,000 crappy Instagram posts in pop psychology to get one or two actual facts.
It's true. Outside of this trauma-informed bubble that I'm definitely in, it sounds like maybe in some ways you've been part of too, have other organizations been responsive, like other NGOs and WHO? Have other organizations been responsive to, for example, this resource, the field guide for Barefoot Psychology, or some of the ways that you at Beyond Conflict were bringing the trauma-informed work into humanitarian efforts?
There's been a lot of interest in the peacebuilding, conflict prevention, and humanitarian space to take a deeper look at trauma. I think there's a risk there in trauma becoming an overused buzzword to say that fixing trauma is the solution for everything. It's not.
Sure.
And we've barely scratched the surface in knowing how to deal with it as a society. So I fear the bastardization and misuse and scapegoating of trauma will lead to actually decreasing quality of services and care. So if anything, I think the massive increase in interest that we've seen across the sector presents a risk. And I think it does a disservice to folks who have experienced things like torture and sexual violence in conflict, because the reality is even folks who live through war, not everyone has post-traumatic stress disorder. Not everyone who lives in a refugee camp has been exposed to big T traumas. Many of them left before the conflict reached their village, crossed a border in a relatively peaceful way, and now are searching for a safe life in a refugee camp. Sure, they're in chronic stress, but even folks that are in what most in the West would deem, dangerous or risky or war-ish environments, not everyone is traumatized or has experienced trauma. And the more that we throw the word around in a cavalier and casual way that, oh, that was traumatizing, I was traumatized, I think that we risk not providing the care to folks who really do need it. Not that we should be gatekeeping who can use the word trauma or who should receive care, because that's a personal decision. But I think it's important for those who aren't trained deeply in the topic to be careful, at least consider how we're using it. But to answer the question more directly, there has been increasing interest not only in the Field Guide for Barefoot Psychology as a specific tool, but more broadly in the notion of psychoeducation. And the way that needs to be done is different from place to place, from culture to culture. I happen to have a strong orientation to the Middle East, which is a culture that has a deep tradition of hard sciences, of biological sciences, that a lot of how we understand modern science and mathematics is due to the Islamic Golden Age. So there's already a cultural bias and fascination with biology. Mm-hmm. The same information might actually be hard to teach in certain conservative evangelical circles that I know in the United States, mm-hmm. where there's sort of a little bit more of an aversion to neurobiology, for example, because it stinks of evolution or something. Yeah. I think there's an incredible interest in psychoeducation, and there's also a tremendous interest in knowing how, if we deal with trauma and mental health challenges in certain hotspot environments, what are the downstream effects, positive effects on things like conflict behaviors, violence, reconciliation, peace processes, things like that. Because I think there's a lot to think about when it comes to how unresolved trauma has shaped cultural and political narratives of different communities. And so what happens if we go back to the source? So there's interest in the tool specifically, but I think more broadly in contextualizable psychoeducation interventions.
Yeah, I appreciate how you're kind of holding the complexity of all this, because I think how you're relating to it on the humanitarian level is also relates to it even just in our society here. That the understanding of trauma, the psychoeducational pieces, is so useful as a society becomes more mature and evolved. And like you said, it's used in many ways that are counterproductive. I want to take it in a different turn, just because I have this great opportunity to talk to someone that I share some experiences with, which is rare. When I worked in humanitarian aid, one of the things that I ended up doing a paper when I came back to the States in my grad school about it. And now we actually have a term in NARM that we call unmanaged empathy. And one of the things that I bumped up against when I was working humanitarian aid is the Westerners that were there providing the aid, obviously leaving their lives at home, coming into unsafe environments. I mean, so many wonderful things to provide service, and yet bringing with them their own patterns and filters and biases. And I started to really observe the way that I felt that a lot of the providers were kind of projecting a certain kind of, I don't know, these terms can feel a little harsh, but a certain kind of like savior mentality where, the white person's coming in and providing all of this service. And I got really interested in it. I wanted to look at my own, which is actually what led me into trauma, because I have a long history of intergenerational cultural trauma, and realizing that I went across the world basically to put me into touch with my own unresolved trauma that everyone was kind of disconnecting from. So I imagine you've had a lot of experiences with Westerners and really well-intentioned people that are often serving the people that they're working with in ways that, again, can perpetuate certain kinds of disconnection or even some kind of relational trauma even. So I wonder what your perspective on that is.
Ooh, I am at risk of saying a lot of controversial things right now.
Well, whatever's comfortable for you. I love it. So
the lens that I think is important to look at all of this through is the lens of power. When working in complex humanitarian environments, that is not exclusively defined by a Western Eastern, a Northern, global North, global South, or a international versus national staff dichotomy. I think it's about power.
Mm.
The dynamics that you're talking about, the saviorism, while there's a particularly pernicious component of it that I think is present among white saviorism, which is a sub-branch of this notion of saviorism, of projection, of living out my own trauma, understanding myself, and me being the ultimate beneficiary of my time working with the poor brown folks, is something that is not exclusive to white Westerners working in environments. I am a brown man with a beard who was working mostly in the Middle East. I can pass as Arab any day of the week. I speak Arabic fluently with a thick South Syrian accent. I am also acutely aware of the fact that this is my choice. I am choosing to meddle in a community that is not my own.
Mm-hmm.
As a son of a migrant, what is my community? Is it defined by the place where I was born? So I have these two competing things within myself. What is my community? Do I have a moral obligation to work exclusively in the neighborhood that I was born in? That can't be the narrow frame that we use. At the same time, what is the moral, ethical responsibility and risk of choosing to work in an environment that is not mine? And I made a commitment to stay, to work in the same communities of folks for the past 10, 12 years. Because I personally don't think it's admirable to go from 1 3-year contract in Burundi to one in Rwanda to one in Papua New Guinea to one in Ukraine. I think that shifting doesn't fully appreciate the gravity of cultural competence in any sort of humanitarian work. At the same time, I have seen local practitioners who are employed as national staff working in humanitarian environments who act out that same saviorism, who get a couple notches on their CV, and then just have increasingly higher pay and become increasingly detached from the actual client population. I think that that's a risk in almost any line of work too, in going into a medical profession, in going into any helping profession. And I think fundamentally it's about power. My father's white. I grew up with enough money to be able to go to a private university. That has created power and privilege that I can cross that power and privilege barrier in the United States too if I was working in certain communities. So while the dynamic is particularly visible in humanitarian environments, that same projection, working out my own stuff while I'm working in another community, me having the aha moment that, oh, now I need to go do trauma-informed yoga in Western Massachusetts for 6 months because I played with the brown people, that same dynamic can happen in our own country too, between folks with power and those without. And so I don't think it necessarily is exclusive to the humanitarian space.
If you're comfortable sharing, how do you yourself kind of work with those tendencies? I mean, if you are working with them, I know for me, I've been working with them for a long time as a therapist. And yeah, how have you related to that?
I have many, many close friends, and most of my closest friends are asylum seekers. The pain of those relationships is really hard to describe, and I'm being really open and honest about this. My closest friends will almost never be able to invite me out to dinner. They don't have money. They're poor. When I invite them out to dinner, do they get mad at me? Are they pissed at me? Look at this American with his money. He can get anything he wants. Do they feel anger towards me? Are they mad at the system that has created me? Are we supposed to not be friends as a result? Am I supposed to, quote unquote, stick with my own kind and them with theirs? When I have a jacket that I now have 2 of for whatever reason, and I give one to my close friend, does he feel like I'm giving him a hand-me-down? Is this pity? You know, when it comes to 2 men of the same age who are supposed to be in the same culturally prescribed position of provider, how do they feel when they are on the receiving end? Have I ever been put in a position when I have had to be on the receiving end? How would it make me feel? The dynamics of those relationships, and you know what? The humanitarian system actually actively discourages the formation of personal relationships between service providers and service recipients for reasons that are grounded in protection, and I completely understand it, and I completely support it in almost every context and manifestation. But the consequence, it contributes to saviorism, because it actually prevents service providers from meaningfully engaging with client populations. And I can hold and appreciate why those rules exist, while also understanding that they are perpetuating of the exact same power dynamics that we're supposed to be fighting against. And it was only because I stayed and ended up leaving the humanitarian post, got to know folks more personally, ended up working together, forming a team together. You know, I was able to hold those relationships for a long period of time. And that anger that they feel, the guilt that I feel, the guilt that they feel, these are dynamics that we're finally able to talk with each other about. And it is painful and it is complicated because I can tell you that I don't know almost any rich kids of privilege who were ever taught how to be friends with poor kids. I'm not a Muslim. I'm an American Christian working mostly with Muslims in the Middle East by choice, precisely because of privilege. The complexity of that dynamic every single day is overwhelming, and I constantly question the ethics of my positionality in those spaces. But at the same time, I think that learning through it, learning hand in hand with them, finding every moment that I feel myself being elevated, trying to take that down a notch and elevating others around me, it's not something I have failed in doing that multiple times. And at the same time, how do I bring my own stress, my own trauma into those relationships? How do those relationships activate my own stress and trauma? And what's the burden and obligation I have to take care of myself in order to show up in the right way in those environments?
I appreciate you being so open about your process. It's really meaningful. And, now my career is very much working with mental health, specifically mental health professionals, but helping professionals of all kind. And this is something that personally, I think it's unethical for anyone that's working in these dynamics, these power dynamics, to not consistently be doing self-reflection and hopefully getting outside support, because we have our own biases when we do our own self-reflection, to see how we are relating to these power dynamics, both between us and our clients, but also just in the systems that we're working with. So I just appreciate it. I've been waiting to ask you that question. I'm excited because I could feel when I was seeing you present that you were aware of some of these same patterns that was at least my fantasy, that you were aware of some of these same things that I have been struggling with for many years.
Yeah, I think it's quite deep, right? And I also have the massive dose of imposter syndrome of not being a clinician, but a person who often talks about mental health. The necessity of rigorous training for those providing mental health care is something I deeply appreciate. The necessity of clinical supervision, of tireless, work, of, not that it should be tireless or underpaid, it should be more supported, but I understand the deep ethical obligation of rigorous training. But at the same time, even the WHO is moving towards, adequate training of lay providers to provide certain subclinical interventions or even clinically tested interventions for folks in environments where there's a scarcity of professionals. And I also think it's important to highlight the tremendous gatekeeping that clinical professionals do in many developing countries, where there's a tremendous hesitance by national, associations, for example, to even sniff anything that is about lay provided care, of any sort of model that's available to be provided by laypersons with significant training and supervision. There's a fear and a hesitance because there's gatekeeping that's done among clinical folks as well.
Yeah.
And I can at the same time appreciate the necessity and the do no harm perspective that requires us to really meaningfully evaluate the safety of lay administered therapies. But at the same time, the sheer reality of just because someone has a clinical certification doesn't necessarily make them or inherently make them better qualified to provide advice than someone's grandma who has lived through tremendous trauma and has come out the other side resilient.
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, I'm relating to this more personally because in our institute, it's been very important as part of our mission that we are primarily focused on mental health professionals, but we always wanted to provide access to other helping professionals that aren't licensed clinicians. It's just been very important for our mission. And we're getting cracked down on by, I don't want to name names, but by certain organizations, because we're doing exactly what you're saying. We're bringing in, quote, lay people. From their perspective, they're lay people, although these are people that, from some of them have been trained in other models for 20, 30, 40 years. But from their perspective, they're not clinicians. And if we're really going to be dedicated to healing trauma, it has to move beyond just clinicians. And if you look at societies, I mean, like you said, I mean, grandparents, elders, it's always been part of traditional societies that
faith leaders.
Yeah, faith leaders, hasn't been gatekeepers in that way. It's been part of the fabric of the communities. And
recovery from trauma has been around a lot longer than clinical psychology.
Exactly. Yeah. And so fighting these battles has been kind of painful and frustrating because we have that same, I loved how you held it, because you hold the understanding for why this is held this way, which we also hold, but we also there is so much suffering in this world. We want to be able to get this work out there as much as possible. And again, that's why I was so drawn to this Barefoot Psychology program that you were doing, because it seemed like that was some of the same intention, to just get the psychoeducational work out there. And you never know how that plants seeds for people and for communities.
Absolutely. And, I encourage folks that are interested to get in touch with Beyond Conflict about it. I know they're continuing to do some great work with the field guide and other related and similar interventions in many places around the world.
I believe that you're not with Beyond Conflict anymore. So I wondered, where are you now and what are you doing? And we're getting to the end here. So how can folks learn more about you and connect with you? And
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm active on LinkedIn. Folks can always connect with me there. I actually, was offered a position at a foundation to help shape their strategy and how they can get more involved on the philanthropic side around issues of migration, mental health, and violence prevention. So I'm, feel fortunate to be stepping into helping shape how we can invest in organizations like Beyond Conflict who are doing good work in communities around the world, but more on the policy and strategy side, where I'll still be able to be doing the work directly as well. So it's a little bit of a shift, but I'm really excited for this new chapter as well.
And Beyond Conflict is still doing the work they're doing?
Absolutely, and they have some fantastic initiatives as well that Dr. Kadari is leading in Central America, with a partner, Glasswing International, who's setting up a sort of system strengthening approach, creating trauma-informed systems in Central America. They have a fantastic program. My colleagues Opiemi and Karen in Nigeria in doing some really cool research on the relationship between trauma and normative attitudes towards violence. So there's still some fantastic work that they're doing, and I encourage folks to get in touch.
Great. And my last curiosity is just next 10, 15 years for you, where do you see your work going and what are you hoping for?
The more that I've thought about this, the more that I know that I'm quite committed to the region and issues of the Middle East. It's just become so close to my heart, and there's a tremendous complexity that's there. It's the holy land for many folks. It holds with it centuries of conflict, centuries of peace, centuries of scientific innovation and resilience. And I think that, even just the faith communities that are contained and have their historical roots in the region can teach us so much and can inform modern mental health practice. I was just in an email exchange with Dr. Rania Awad the other day, who's done some fantastic work on looking at early Islamic civilizations and how they've dealt with psychiatric aftercare and cash sums for folks who were released from inpatient wards in Baghdad and, all over the place in the region. So I think there's such a tremendous cultural legacy that the region holds that can teach us how we expand lay-provided services, paraprofessional services for folks where, unfortunately, trauma is going to continue largely unabated in that part of the world for a long time because of colonial legacies, past 20 years of foreign policy legacies, and the fight over resources. So I'm deeply committed to understanding how we understand what healing means, what are the goalposts of healing, and what are the impacts of healing for individuals, for family units, and for entire countries that are navigating simultaneous recovery from and, growth into new conflicts.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for being part of Transforming Trauma here. I'm sure many people are going to get a lot out of this, and it's great work that you've been part of and really helpful to learn more about it. And I hope we might have follow-up conversations. I'd love to learn more and maybe even collaborate at some point. But thanks for all the work that you're doing and for sharing with us.
Thank you for really provocative and deep questions. I know we just scratched the surface of the answers, but I think they're really important. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more about our guest and their work, check the show notes or visit us at narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. If you're a licensed mental health professional working with complex trauma, we're excited to share with you about our upcoming NARM therapist trainings. Level 2 training is a clinical training where you will get trained in a comprehensive developmental framework and clinical approach for resolving the long-term impacts of ACEs and CPTSD. You will receive individualized support from a team of skilled and supportive trainers led by NARM senior faculty Brad Kammer. Learn more about this training or reserve your spot by visiting www.narmtraining.com/schedule. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community, connection with you, and changing the world by transforming trauma.